I never believed in ghosts, not until I found myself standing at the rusted iron gates of St. Matthias Churchyard in a town so small you'd miss it if you blinked while driving past. The locals called it Hollowfield, a name that felt unsettling in itself. I was just passing through, looking for old landmarks to photograph. But the moment I stepped into that graveyard, something felt off. The air was colder here than it should have been, carrying a faint scent of damp earth and something else, something rotten. The church itself was abandoned, its once proud steeple now a jagged silhouette against the dying sun. The graves were old, older than the town itself, it seemed. Some headstones had names so weathered that they were nothing but whispers in stone. Others bore strange markings, symbols I didn't recognize, but they sent a strange chill through me. As I wandered deeper, I noticed something disturbing. Fresh flowers on graves that hadn't been touched in decades. A bouquet of white lilies lay on a headstone dated 1896. Another grave, its name completely eroded, had a single candle burning beside it. And then, the whispers started. At first I thought it was the wind playing tricks on me. But no, the voices were real, low, hushed, coming from somewhere among the graves. I turned, scanning the shadows. Nothing, just the stillness of the graveyard and the skeletal trees that loomed like silent watchers. That's when I saw it. A figure standing near the church ruins, dressed in black, motionless, their face hidden beneath the dark veil. I blinked. They were gone. The cold tightened around my throat, and for the first time in my life, I felt true fear. I should have left right then. But I didn't, and that was my first mistake. I should have left. Every nerve in my body told me to turn around, walk back through that rusted gate, and never look back. But something kept me there. Maybe curiosity, maybe something else. The air felt heavier now, as if the night itself was pressing down on me. My breath came out in short, misty puffs, even though it wasn't that cold. I took a hesitant step toward where I had seen the veiled figure, my footsteps crunching against the gravel path. The graves around me seemed different. The inscriptions clearer, the symbols more pronounced. Was it just my imagination? A sudden sound snapped me out of my daze. A bell. A single deep chime rang out from the abandoned church tower. I froze. That was impossible. The church had been abandoned for decades. No one had set foot inside for years. And yet, the old bell tolled, as if summoning something. The wind picked up, rustling the overgrown grass and making the dead leaves swirl around my feet. And then I heard it. A soft weeping. It came from somewhere ahead, near a row of crumbling headstones. The sound was faint, almost fragile, like someone crying from the depths of a nightmare. I hesitated, but my feet moved on their own. As I stepped closer, I saw her. A woman sat slumped against a gravestone, her body shaking with quiet sobs. She wore a long black dress, tattered at the edges, and her dark hair spilled over her shoulders, obscuring her face. My throat went dry. "Miss, are you okay?" I managed to ask. She didn't respond. I took another step, my boots crunched against the gravel. The sound made her body jerk, sudden, unnatural. She lifted her head just enough for me to see her fingers, gripping the gravestone. They were raw and bloody, as if she had been clawing at the earth. A sharp chill ran down my spine. Something was very, very wrong. I wanted to back away, but before I could, the woman stopped crying. The air turned eerily silent, as if the graveyard itself was holding its breath. Then slowly, she tilted her head upward. and I saw her face. Or rather, the lack of it. Her skin was smooth, featureless, no eyes, no mouth, no nose. Just a blank, pale surface stretched tight like wax over a skull. My body locked in place, horror rooting me to the ground. Then she moved, not like a person, but like a puppet whose strings had been yanked. Her limbs jerked as she lunged toward me, her hands outstretched. I stumbled back, barely dodging her grasp. My foot caught on a broken gravestone, and I went crashing to the ground. Pain shot through my arm, but I didn't have time to register it. The woman stood over me now, her head twitching unnaturally to the side, her faceless void staring down. And then, in a voice that wasn't a voice at all, a whisper inside my skull, she spoke. "He sees you." The church bell rang again, and everything went black. When I woke up, I was no longer in the graveyard. The cold, damp earth beneath me had been replaced by rough wooden planks. My head throbbed, and my vision blurred as I tried to sit up. The air smelled of dust, mold, and something metallic, blood. I was inside the abandoned church. The shattered stained glass windows cast eerie, fractured patterns across the floor, and the moonlight struggled to push through the filth-covered panes. The pews were broken, scattered as if something had ripped through them in a frenzy. The altar stood at the far end, but the crucifix above it was missing, leaving only an empty gaping space. I didn't remember walking here. I didn't remember anything after that faceless woman's whisper. "He sees you." I swallowed hard. Who was he? A scraping sound echoed from behind me. I turned too fast, my breath catching in my throat. In the dimness, near the broken entrance, a figure stood. It was an old man, hunched and frail-looking, his tattered coat hanging loosely from his bony frame. His face was gaunt, hollow eyes sunken deep into his skull. He stared at me like he had been waiting. "You saw her, didn't you?" he rasped. His voice was dry, cracked, like someone who hadn't spoken in years. I couldn't bring myself to answer. The old man took a slow, shuffling step closer. "She only appears to the ones who don't belong here." My skin prickled. "What do you mean?" I managed to whisper. The man exhaled sharply. "You came to this town uninvited. The dead know it. They always know." I wanted to deny it, to say I was just a traveler, a stranger passing through. But something's about the way he said it. It felt true. I forced myself to stand, ignoring the dull ache in my legs. "Who are you?" The old man tilted his head slightly. "I was once the caretaker of this church." His lips curled into something that might have been a smile, but there was no warmth in it. Until I saw too much. A chill ran down my spine. "What happened here?" I asked. His expression darkened. "This town was built on something cursed, something that should have been left alone. The graveyard, the church, they were meant to keep it contained." I didn't like where this was going. The man turned his gaze toward the shattered windows. "The faceless woman. She's just a warning." His fingers twitched as he spoke, his voice trembling slightly. "She shows herself to those who are close to seeing the truth. And if you saw her, boy," his eyes locked onto mine, "something haunted and desperate in them, then he knows you're here." That name again. He. "Who is he?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The old man's face twisted with something between fear and regret. "You don't want to know?" A heavy silence settled between us. Then, before I could press further, he let out a shaky breath. You need to leave. Now. Before midnight, I glanced at my watch. 11:46 p.m. 14 minutes. Why? What happens at midnight? The old man took another step back, shaking his head. If you're still here, he'll come for you. And then, as if on cue, the church bell tolled. Not from the broken tower above us. No. This time, it came from beneath us. The floorboards beneath my feet trembled with the force of the sound. The air grew heavy, suffocating, as the shadows in the corners of the church began to shift. The old man's eyes widened. It's too late. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut, and the whispering began again. This time it was all around me. He had arrived. The whispering voices crawled through the air like invisible fingers, brushing against my skin, threading into my ears. Software cold, unnatural. The old caretaker stood frozen, his lips moving silently as if praying. But I could see the fear in his eyes. He knew what was coming. And then, the church floor split open. A deep resounding crack ripped through the wood beneath us, exposing a gaping void where the earth should have been. A black abyss, endless and hungry. The bell's phantom chime came from inside it, each toll rattling my bones. The whispers became voices, many voices. Some wept, some pleaded, some laughed, a dry, hollow laughter that curdled my blood. And then I saw them. Hands, dozens of them, pale and twisted, reached up from the darkness, clawing at the edges of the broken floor. Their fingers were too long, their nails jagged like something that had been scratching at stone for centuries. The old man staggered backward. "You weren't supposed to see this," he whispered. His voice shook thick with terror. I couldn't move. One of the hands grasped the edge of a pew, pulling something up from the pit. A figure. No, not a figure. Something else. It was tall. Its body wrapped in something that looked like ancient tattered robes. The fabric didn't flow. It seemed to twitch and breathe like living flesh. Its head was covered in a cracked porcelain mask, featureless, smooth, except for two hollowed-out holes where the eyes should have been. But the worst part? The mask was shifting. The surface rippled like melting wax, forming and reforming faces. A child's scream, a mother's sorrow, a man's silent open-mouthed horror. I realized what I was looking at. Every face it had ever taken. The air thickened, pressing against me like unseen hands. My chest tightened, my breath coming in short gasps. I couldn't look away. The caretaker fell to his knees. His voice broke into desperate whispers. "He is the watcher, the collector of the forgotten." My stomach twisted. "What does that mean?" The old man's gaze snapped to mine. "Every town has its secrets, boy. This town, was built on something that was never meant to be disturbed." His voice cracked. "We buried them. We buried him. But you—" His breath hitched. "You woke him up." A deep guttural sound filled the church. Laughter. The creature had stepped fully out of the pit now, its mask twitching between countless agonized faces. It raised one of its rotting skeletal hands, and the shadows in the church moved with it. The pews rotted. The stained glass bled. The walls breathed. I staggered backward, my mind screaming at me to wake up from whatever nightmare this was. But I knew, this wasn't a dream. The caretaker grabbed my wrist. "You have one chance," he rasped. "Do not look into its true face." The shadows twisted, the walls groaned, and then the creature reached up, its porcelain mask cracking, to pull it off. The old man shoved me toward the door. "Run!" I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted toward the entrance, but the doors refused to budge. The walls were closing in, warping as if the entire church was bending, twisting into something else. The whispers grew louder, angrier. Behind me, I heard a horrible, wet, ripping sound. The creature had removed its mask. The caretaker screamed, a sound so raw, so broken, it made my insides churn. I knew, without turning around, he had looked, and now he was lost. With a final desperate push, I slammed my shoulder into the doors. They gave way. I tumbled out onto the cold, damp earth of the graveyard. The moment my feet hit the ground, everything went silent. I turned. The church was still there. The doors were closed. But there was no sign of the caretaker. No sign of the creature. The only thing that remained was a single porcelain mask lying in the dirt. It was smooth, featureless, waiting for a new face. I stared at the mask. It lay in the dirt, perfectly still, reflecting the pale moonlight. The smooth, featureless surface seemed to watch me, even without eyes. I wanted to leave it there. I should have left it there. But something inside me whispered otherwise. Take it. My hand moved before my mind could protest. The moment my fingers brushed against the porcelain, a sharp, cold shock raced through my veins. Not cold like winter, cold like something ancient, something dead. And then the graveyard shifted. The church behind me groaned, its walls warping and twisting like something alive. The gravestones tilted, their inscriptions writhing and changing before my eyes. The names of the buried vanished, replaced by something else. My name. I stumbled back, dropping the mask. My breath came in ragged gasps as I looked around. The trees that had once lined the graveyard were gone. The iron gate I had entered through? Gone. The church, the gravestones, the earth beneath my feet, all that remained was an endless stretch of fog. And then, from somewhere deep within the mist, a voice called my name. Not a whisper, not a moan, a perfect replica of my own voice. My stomach twisted as something stepped out of the fog. It was me. Number, not exactly me. It had my height, my face, my eyes, but empty. Like a photograph where the soul had been stripped away. It moved in a slow, unnatural way, its head tilting slightly, as if studying me. Then it smiled. Not a normal smile, a too wide, stretched, unnatural grin. I couldn't move. It spoke. You left the door open. My heartbeat slammed in my ears. What? It took another step forward. You let him out. The fog thickened, curling around my legs, pulling me down. I struggled, but it was like sinking in tar. The other me just stood there, watching, grinning. I fought harder. My limbs were numb, heavy. The mask lay inches from my fingertips, its smooth surface calling to me. Somewhere, deep in the mist, the church bell rang. 1, 2. The fog tightened around my chest. 3. The other me took another step forward. Its face began to change. The porcelain mask had no features. Neither did I anymore. I opened my mouth to scream. 4. The mask shattered. The fog vanished. And suddenly, I was back in the graveyard. The church stood where it had always been, silent and broken. The gravestones were back in place, the trees motionless beneath the cold night sky. I gasped for air, my body drenched in sweat. Was it real? Had I imagined it? Then I saw it, the caretaker's coat. It lay crumpled near the entrance of the church, but he was gone. I forced myself to move, my legs shaking. I had to get out, had to leave this town. As I stumbled toward the gate, a soft crunch beneath my foot made me freeze. I looked down. A single fragment of porcelain, the last piece of the mask, and then, just behind me, a whisper. You left the door open,